John 6:59. Tauta apen in synagoge, didaskon in Capharnaum. Here we're at the end of Jesus' long discourse about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, his conversation with this crowd that's found him after the miraculous feeding. And it's a reminder, isn't it, that these are actual historical events that are reported. John tells us where this dialogue happened. We read, Jesus is the subject here. Jesus said these things in a synagogue, or perhaps in the synagogue, while teaching in Capernaum. Didaskon there is an adverbial participle. If you have no article in front of a participle, and sometimes the article can be earlier in the sentence, but if you have no article in front of it, it's almost always going to be adverbial. And then you just have to determine whether to, in English, what the logical connection is. And we usually make that more explicit in English with words like while or as, although, because, if. This just seems like a temporal introduction works well here. While teaching in Capernaum. You'll notice that most English translations translate this as in the synagogue. He said these things in the synagogue while teaching in Capernaum. That translation assumes that the town of Capernaum, based on archaeological evidence, would have had one synagogue, which I think is a reasonable conclusion or assumption based on what we know. In fact, if you've been to Capernaum, if you've been to the Holy Land, you probably have visited the remains of a synagogue there. I do think the remains of the visible remains of the synagogue are from a later period, but probably was a first-century synagogue underneath those remains, or there some remains of a first-century synagogue in that same place. So that could be the very place where these things were said. Remember, in Greek, when you have a preposition followed by a noun, many times, even if that noun is definite, the article will not be present. So context would have to tell us whether this is in a synagogue or in the synagogue.